So I've got a new favorite Reaktor tool. It's my favorite for a number of reasons that seem to be worth describing in a video. This one is really nothing more than these 4 devices for looping audio. It doesn't make any attempt to slice the audio by transients or anything like that. In essence, it gives you the opportunity to simply restart the loop based on MIDI note input. So if you want to start the loop at the beginning, you input this C note. If you want the loop to start somewhere along here, you press this F note. The keys show you how the loop can be restarted. Here you can see there's a slicing tool here, a knob that jumps from 4 to 64. This knob, called bass, lets you specify exactly what the first note is. So if you want, for instance, to start on C4, you set it to 60, and there it is, a C. And you could set it to 12 so that you're dividing you've just got an octave for whatever audio is in here. And you could do the exact same thing for each of these, so that if you had a 4-octave keyboard, you could devote each octave to a different one of these looping engines. Basically, you can think of these as channel strips in a 4-channel mixer that's devoted to playing 4 simultaneous samples and looping them. And the samples, of course, come from sample maps. There's 4 different sample maps that come with the thing out of the box. 1 and 4 are basically percussion or drum oriented. 2 is more melodic lead kind of sounds, and 3 is a collection of bass phrases. But of course you can put whatever you want in there, and that's really part of the pleasure of this device. The Reaktor sample maps are very easy to deal with. So 4 sample map players, each one in a kind of a channel strip that gives you amplitude, a way of selecting the particular entry in the sample map, a knob for globally pitch shifting the loop up or down an octave. Next along the channel strip here, we come to a very nice EQ, 3-band EQ, gain, frequency, and Q, a stereo widener, which is not really a pan control. Do you want it centered, or do you want it to have a sense of stereo space? And then finally a fuzzy reverb, which I usually leave off or set very low. And of course you can turn each one on and off. Before we go on, one other thing to point out, these loopers are not simply samplers. They're called stereo multisample beat loop resynthesizers. They synchronize loop samples regardless of the original tempo to a clock source. In other words, to the beats per minute of the Reaktor engine here. When you turn this on, you're starting the clock source. And it preserves accurate timing and keeps transients crisp across a wide range of pitch and tempo without changing the pitch. So in other words, as you speed up and slow down the clock, the loop just plays faster or slower, but doesn't repitch. If you want to repitch it, you have to use the pitch tool, and that acts globally on the whole loop. If the loop doesn't inherently change pitch at different places, then there's nothing about these keys that's going to have any effect on the pitch. Okay, let's take a closer look at the way the clock works. Loaded the same sample in each of the instruments here. And as you can see, they're all rolling along at the same rate, but they're all completely different starting points. And you can also see that they're not all set to the same number of slices. They're not running in sync, and every time I hit a new starting point, of course, they just go to another non-synchronized place. All you have to do to get them set so that they're starting at the same place is to set up each set of controls for each playback device so they're all the same. By hitting one note, I'm restarting all of them at exactly the same point, and they're just in lockstep with each other. But what's more interesting, if I now switch back to the previous snap where they weren't in lockstep at all, they're still in lockstep. In other words, two things. You can't store the start point with a snap, but you can also depend on the playback from snap to snap will be the same if you switch to a new snap and some of them are playing the same sample, which is pretty handy. In other words, it means you can set up a string of snaps, all of which are going to sound the same for some of these instruments and may change only one or two of them. Say the percussion could be exactly the same from snap to snap, and by switching between them, you won't be restarting anything if it's set up exactly the same as in the previous snap. So here they are all locked in step, but if I switch to a setting where only one of the players is running a different sample, you'll see that it's going at a different rate, and the thing that determines that rate is the actual physical length of the sample itself. And if we switch back then to our original snap, you can see that the other three are staying completely in sync with one another, and they're not changing as I switch back and forth. So that's very handy. Here's an example of playing with snaps the way I just described. I've set up some of my own samples in here, and I'm just whacking away at the keyboard and changing snaps. So one of the interesting things that I found about doing this is that if you do have the same sample in each playback device, it's kind of fun to throw them out of sync with one another just by turning them on and off. All it takes is one key hit anywhere to bring them all back together again. The way the developer describes the intended way of using this is not so much with hands-on, live, real-time playing, but to use sequencers or the piano roll of a DAW to set up repeating loops of MIDI notes so that you get a consistent reorganizing of any given loop by throwing it a consistent loop of MIDI starting points. So that does make sense, but it brings up the question of, well, what's the best way to set that up? Of course, this being Reaktor, my first impulse is to simply look for a Reaktor tool that will help me sequence the MIDI input. So for my first experiment in adding a sequencer to Loop Rework, I went to the library, Reaktor Factory Library, Legacy Library, Reaktor 3, Sequencer Melody, and just grabbed Big Sequencer. I dragged it into the top level of the structure view and added a note pitching gate object and hooked it up. While we're here, you can see the possibility of having separate outs for each of the 4 engines, but by default it's one out. I also added here a limiter from the user library, and inside Big Sequencer I added a module also from the user library called Easy Randomize. So back to the front panel, here's the Easy Randomize added to our sequencer, which is basic but pretty well spec'd. As you can see, there's others in here to play with, all quite interesting. And here's the maximizer that I added. So you'll also notice that I did a few things to the original ensemble. First of all, I went to settings and turned off automatic panel layout so that I could access each individual instrument. And for each of the channel strip loop players, I went to Instrument Properties, View, and switched on Show Header. Just basically because this is how I prefer to work. It seems handy to be able to create snapshots for the individual players. This is certainly not essential for sequencing. I just wanted to explain why it looks a little different. So for snapshots, you can see up here it says Loop Rework, and here are the options. We've got the ensemble, 1, 2, 3, 4 players, the sequencer that I added in the maximizer. Then we have this option to follow instrument selection. The developer suggests leaving this unchecked so that no matter where you click, the snaps stay the same. But for the way I prefer to work is to follow instrument selection so that when we click on the individual elements, we can see the snapshots for them. And to get back to the master snapshots that handle everything, you just click on the background. So that gets us back to Loop Rework. So what I'll do here is play through some of the snaps that I created to show off the action of the sequencer. I'll make some changes to some of the settings in the individual channel strips so you can get a sense of how that can sound, and change the beats per minute a few times. So these are all using the factory sample map without any additions for me. And I've got it set up to something very basic. The next snap turns the sequencer on. You can see it's mostly affecting number 2, but a little bit of number 1. So if I wanted to make sure that number 1 wasn't being affected at all by the sequencer, the simplest thing to do is just to change the bass note, max it out in either direction, because the sequencer down here is unlikely to ever be set to bare minimum or maximum. Now, if I change any sequencer settings, like randomize, for instance, they're just affecting the playback in number 2. Probably the most interesting control here on the sequencer is the transpose function. Basically what that's doing is it's not changing the pattern, of course, it's just changing the MIDI note number. So of course that's going to change the starting point up here, even though again the pattern doesn't change. So we've also got the option to switch between the internal beats per minute or the external ones. Click the external, and now we're back to the sequencer running at 100 beats per minute. track here, a 54-second loop. Here's the sequencer on. And here it is set to not be affected by the sequencer no matter what I do with the sequencer. So this changes the beats per minute to 150 compared to 100. This adds the sequencer to the melody loop at 130 beats per minute. Same melody loop sequencer action, but now the overall engine is running at 50 beats per minute. And you can see that the sample resynthesizer here is kind of struggling to, in its effort to slow down that much, it starts wobbling the playback position. Started to play with the EQ and the reverb and the widener. Added some percussion. And as you can see, I've set it so that it's never going to be affected by the sequencer input. Adding some bass here. Is being affected by the sequencer. So it will be affected by the transpose. Okay, so the next thing to consider is obviously that we can automate the movement of these knobs. So let's take a look at that. So here's another version of the ensemble that I've saved. It's using a similar basic legacy sequencer with the randomize function, a few less controls. So I added an on and off switch for the pitch send. The main thing I've done here is add two IC sending modulators, a step sequencer and a recordable fader. And using the IC send function here, I sent them to modulate the pitch knob of number 2. And for this one, I've set this to modulate the transpose function of the sequencer. Also, I'm using some of my own loops here, mainly in number 2. So, there's no modulation going on here at all. And turn the pitch on. Here you can see how useful it is to be able to just click on any object, any instrument, and immediately go to its snapshots if it has them. So I've got this to set to, so this moves this down a fifth. let's now turn the transpose function on for the sequencer. And I'll flip through a few of these. Everything's off. Everything's off, so you're just hearing this one guitar loop go by. Same thing here.
Yeah.